fine, just testing this works, yes. Hi everyone, my name is Nuria Shoro. I'm the head of operations at Earth Minutes. We're a youth-led creative and research collective, and we're driving the future of environmental thinking and learning. And I'm joined here today by an incredible panel. I'm just gonna ask you all to give just 1-minute intros to yourselves. I know that's hard, but we'll start with Ben and just move along that way.
Ben Goldsmith. I work in green investment and also in rewilding, nature conservation. I'm the founder of Conservation Collective, which is a network of locally focused environment foundations. And I set up a new initiative called Natagal, which is about restoring ecosystems at scale. We raise money to invest in land and to rent land in order to rewild it.
My name is Merlin Hambry-Tennyson. I have founded with my wife a business called Kabila Cornwall down in Cornwall, which is a wellness retreat site that brings veterans with PTSD, NHS nurses suffering from stress, anxiety, and burnout, and well-being and business groups together into one of Britain's last rainforests. I'm also the managing director of a charity called the Thousand Year Trust, which is the only charity in the UK dedicated to the restoration of Britain's rainforests, and our mission is to triple the amount of rainforest growing in the UK over the next 30 years.
Hi, I'm Mandy Liu. I run the Nature Restoration and Food Production project out in Hampshire called Ewhurst Park. And I also run a biodiversity fund called ARC, trying to get investments into any biodiversity project and really encourage nature regeneration and restoration.
Hi, my name's Lizzie Crotty, and I am the Head of Development for Australian Wildlife Conservancy in the UK. I'm originally from Tasmania, and I've been over here in London for about 5 years. And what we do here is we raise money, raise awareness, and form partnerships to create impact for wildlife back in Australia.
Awesome, thanks so much for introducing yourselves. So this discussion is around restoring natural habitats and species. And I wanted to just kick off with Ben. How would you define restoring natural habitats and species? What does that actually mean?
So I think the big realization of the last 10, 15 years is that without wildlife, landscapes are just scenery. You know, that wildlife is much more important than we ever thought. You know, that especially keystone wildlife. There are certain species which are engines in the machine that without them, you don't have the natural processes on which everything else depends. So I'm sure everyone in this room is aware of the NEP rewilding project in Sussex. What they showed there is that if you restore these natural processes, you know, the grazing and browsing and trampling by big heavy herbivores, you know, the trapping of water and the damming activities of beavers, you know, the ploughing of the soil by pigs or wild boar, you get superabundance of wildlife in a way that, you know, we're simply unused to experiencing in Britain today. Now, NEP has gone from being a dead zone, you know, a failing industrial farm 25 years ago, to a place where you find the highest concentration of breeding songbirds of anywhere in Britain. They're the only place in northwestern Europe where nightingales and turtle doves and all these other species which are disappearing are on the increase. So I think for me, it's about restoring that dynamism, restoring those natural processes, and not focusing too much on what the outcomes may be. You know, conservation has always been about defining the outcomes and trying to achieve them. You know, we want tree pipits here, so we'll manage it just for tree pipits. Well, I think that really nature restoration is about letting natural processes play out in the way that they will. And this realization has become pretty mainstream, and that's why everyone's now aware of rewilding. There's a bit of a rewilding kind of trend going on, which is very, very exciting, and I think somewhat unstoppable, and you see it everywhere now.
Amazing. And you're the founder of Conservation Collective. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and the pillars that make up Conservation Collective?
So there's not enough philanthropy in the world to rewild in the way that we need to rewild. We've got to rewild the world. We've got to restore half. I mean, E.O. Wilson says nature needs half. You know, we need to restore natural, functional ecosystems everywhere we can, and we need to do it really fast. And so we need financial incentives to do that. Philanthropy is not able to do that. But philanthropy has a really, really important role to play. You know, that philanthropy, you know, that £5 you chuck into a box outside the railway station, or that standing order that you make, or those big grants that Jeff Bezos is making, or Bill Gates, philanthropy has a really important role to play in catalyzing systemic change. Sometimes you do need to bring a lawsuit against companies which are behaving badly, or you need to help governments think through a new policy, and then you need to whip up the public to demand that the policy becomes law. You need to fund advocacy and litigation and kind of systems change work, sometimes research, those kinds of things. And that's where philanthropy, I think, is really, really vital. So there isn't enough of it to do the job, but there is enough to change the system. And so the Conservation Collective is a network of locally focused environment foundations. We have 21 foundations now. We have one in Sri Lanka. Some of the team are here. We have one in Barbados, another one in Devon, the Highlands and Islands Environment Foundation, Cyprus, Malta. And the idea is to gather groups of people and companies and other organizations in those places that have a strong connection with those places and raise money and distribute it at the grassroots to the best local initiatives. So I was sent a video yesterday of our Cyprus Environment Foundation team standing with a group of birdwatchers releasing vultures into the skies of Cyprus. They were a keystone species which has been missing from Cyprus for decades. And we paid for 25 of them to be brought in crates from Spain, and another 25 next year and the year after, and we're restoring vultures to Cyprus. And in the process, we've raised awareness about the importance of wildlife and species. And this kind of thing doesn't cost very much money, but philanthropy has an important role to play.
That sounds absolutely incredible. And speaking about connecting to your sort of local roots, Merlin, I want to go over to you and just talk a bit about the 1,000-Year Trust and the work that you're doing there. Because when you think of the UK, you don't think of rainforests. But after reading on your website, up to 20% of the British Isles used to be covered in temperate rainforests. And I know when I think of rainforests, I think of very distant lands. I don't think of the UK. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the work that you're doing there.
I mean, well, you just said it. You're absolutely right. I love to, whenever I'm talking about the charity and our work, I love to ask in the audience, and I'm going to do that now actually, and ask this audience if there's anyone who before today didn't realize we had rainforests in the UK. Is there any, some brave hands going up, thank you. And it's amazing how just 3 or 4 years ago, I used to ask that question, you get 80% of hands going up. Everybody thought rainforests were very much a tropical habitat. And now with things like David Attenborough talking about them in the Wild Isles series, and Guy Shrubsole's amazing book, which I encourage everyone to read, The Lost Rainforests of Britain, and people like Aviva, who've given £38 million to the wildlife trusts to protect and restore Britain's rainforests, we're beginning to remember and realize that we are a rainforest people who live on a rainforest island. We've done exactly what is currently happening in places like Brazil, where pristine tropical rainforest is being cut down by farmers so that they can turn it into cattle grazing land, the cattle being entirely non-native to South America. We just 3,000 years ago did it here, cut down our pristine rainforest in order to create grazing land for sheep, a totally non-native creature to the UK. It's about as normal as having camels roaming across our uplands, having sheep here. We've just got very short memories. And so you're absolutely right that 3,000 years ago, 20% of the UK was a rainforest landscape. We're now down to less than 1%, about 0.5%. We've decimated this habitat. And when we all grew up at school learning about rainforests, it was the tropical variety. Now humans have cut down 50% of the world's tropical rainforest, but we've cut down over 99% of our temperate rainforests. So our charity is focused on bringing awareness of that habitat to the general public, especially here in the UK, and making sure that this point that we've reached is the nadir. It's the bottom of the bell curve. It's that handbrake turn moment where we make sure it never goes lower and that we restore them and bring them back and learn how we, as a rainforest people, can learn to live amongst them and with them and protect them and love them as well.
Incredible. Where can you find rainforests in the UK?
So they tend to be in our western reaches. So to be designated rainforest, and there's a lot of debate around the actual designation, but in the same way that there are hundreds of different habitats under the umbrella of tropical rainforest, there are different habitats throughout the Atlantic temperate rainforest zone. So it really runs from Bergen in southwest Norway down to Braga in northern Portugal, with us in Bodmin in the middle, a lot of bees. And you have to have over 1,400 millimeters of rain per year. It must fall across the year. Very native species, so things like oak and rowan and hazel and willow. And then the real defining factor is the epiphytes, the plants that grow upon other plants. So rather than burying their roots into the soil, these oak trees, especially a single oak, can hold up to 600 species living on it at any one time. These aren't trees, they're cities, they're fizzing, bubbling communities of carbon sequestering and biodiversity supporting life. They're what really make these rainforests so special.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the scientific research that's going on in this project?
So that's what everything the charity is focused on at the moment is about. And I like to compare with tropical and temperate rainforests in this moment, that if you're a young scientist or a young researcher and you want to make your career in rainforests, it's almost 99% certain you'll choose to do that in tropical rainforest zone. And that makes a lot of sense because there are hundreds of universities, research institutes, and research stations where you can go and join multi-year, multidisciplinary research programs. You can co-author peer-reviewed papers, influence government policy, influence societal opinion about tropical rainforests. If you're mad and you choose to make your career in Atlantic temperate rainforests, there is not a single university, course, institute, or research station where you can go and do that. So the 1,000 Year Trust, we're building Europe's first Atlantic temperate rainforest research station on Bodmin Moor, which will welcome in researchers from across the world. And my dream is that it'll be built by April next year. And my dream is that we will have scientists coming from places like Brazil and Borneo and Colombia, from tropical rainforest zones, who can come into a temperate rainforest zone and teach us, while studying these habitats, how to restore them in the way they're doing in countries that perhaps are far more experienced than we are. And it will be a good example of that shift in knowledge transfer from the global north to the global south. It's time we started listening and learning rather than just telling.
And it's convenient that the next Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has successfully built a rainforest research center called Sophia Point in Guyana, which is the country of at least one of his parents' origin. So you need to tap up David Lammy.
I would love to.
That's really fascinating. At Earth Minutes, we talk a lot around the disconnection that people have between people and planet, and particularly learning about rainforests in the UK and what used to be, and all the amazing work that you're doing to restore those habitats and work globally to restore local habitats is absolutely incredible. And I want to move over to Mandy. So you bought Ewhurst Farm, and I wanted to just ask you a bit about that. How did that come about? What was your inspiration for restoring the land there?
I think the first evening I was there, I was very obvious. It was pin drop silence. And I remember I have some friends were with me and they said, "Oh, this is so lovely, it's so quiet." And I said, "No, this is insidious. Something is terribly wrong here." I grew up in Malaysia, in the tropics, and it is loud.
Yep.
It is so loud, especially in the evening. You hear the crickets, you hear all kinds of insects coming to life, and it was pin drop silence. So it was a no-brainer, and I the next day I was like, okay, there's a lot of work to do here, so let's get cracking. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And out of curiosity, did you have a background in rewilding or restoration before that?
No, I don't. But I grew up in Malaysia. Nature is my playground, and so I really yearn for it. I miss it throughout my career. I've been very fortunate. I got to travel around the world, but I always miss that connection with nature that I feel like a lot of us has lost. And when Ewhurst came up, I thought, what a great opportunity to have this space, to open it up and get people engaged and reconnect with nature. So one of the first things that I did was actually to get connected with the local schools and say, "Hi, I have space here, and we're not doing what the previous owners are doing anymore, and please come." And we started working with them with their curriculum. I really believe, you're our next generation. It's so important to get all of you engaged and emotionally attached to our future and how we could make it better.
Yeah, I think climate action and really taking tangible actions, so through visiting places like Ewhurst Park and getting schools involved, is so important. What kind of species do you find there now? How have you restored it?
Monitoring and baselining, if anybody asks me what's the most important thing in your project, is just that. When the first year we barely, we did a transac and we did our first survey and it did not look good. And I'm very happy to say the last survey we did, it was amazing. Just looking at the grass, there's 66 new grass species that came up, and minimal intervention. All we did was take out pheasant shooting, and that's it. And things will slowly come back. And hopefully, you know, we just started a volunteering program. We want to upskill people who are interested in this area, get more rangers on site so that, you know, they could start identifying plant species, you know, your insects, your invertebrate.
That sounds incredible. And I just wanted to ask quickly about what the previous owners would have done to have gotten it to the state where you end up there and hearing pin drop silence. What challenges, how did it end up in that state? If you have any insight on that.
Yeah, I think it was definitely a very different land management approach. You know, they were farming for something very specific. It's there's a lot of monoculture, and where we are, you know, we don't have the best soil, so it's really marginal land that you're trying to put some really heavy artificial inputs to make it work, to grow food. So one of the things that we're doing at UHUS is actually we're working really hard to demonstrate that nature-friendly farming is very important, and there are space for rewilding and also food production, not done to scale, but you know the whole thing should be viewed as an ecosystem as a whole. You know, everything, the animals and insects and the birds should thrive together with us while we're trying to grow food and regenerate the soil, the mycorrhiza, the earthworm population, the good bacteria in the soil. So everything's interconnected, really.
It's so true. And we've been talking a lot about UK space, and I just want to come on to you, Lizzie, and talk about why we have to sort of consider restoration globally. So it'd be great to hear more about the work that you're doing with the AWC.
Sure. It's great to be here, and it's so interesting hearing a bit about what everyone's doing, and we're all trying to achieve the same thing, and we are achieving the same thing, but we are facing different threats, I think, and that changes your management style. So perhaps I'll just start with why Australian Wildlife Conservancy exists. So Australia, as most people actually aren't aware, is the country with the worst rate of recent mammal extinctions globally. So we've had 40 species of mammal become extinct in the last 200 years. So it's pretty shocking and not a great title to hold. Right now, there are about 1,900 species that are threatened or are facing extinction. So what we do is we are based out in the field on sanctuary sites, and we get in there and we stop these appalling rates of decline and start to turn that dial around. So we're working across an area around 12.9 million hectares, which is just shy of the size of England. So huge landscapes we're working across. And these sites are either sites that we directly own, so we purchase them, or they're partnership sites with government, private landholders, cattle stations, and First Nations communities as well.
Amazing. And how do these rewilding practices differ from those in the UK?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think the term rewilding is fantastic, because a lot of people can resonate with it, and it means, it's what we all want to achieve. However, it's quite different if we think about it in that very traditional NEP sense that Ben was talking about at the start, which is letting nature run its course and, sort of returning it to nature and natural processes. It's quite different from that. So with Australia being the largest island in the world, islands are fantastic at having beautiful species radiation and biodiversity, endless biodiversity. But what they're not so great at is dealing with other species or disturbances that come into an island ecosystem. So what happened around 200 years ago that caused this massive decline was that we had European settlers arrive in Australia, And with them they brought rats, mice, cats, foxes, donkeys, cows, camels, basically anything, and weeds, a whole bunch of weeds as well. So we've got this massive, massive disturbance in a really short time from a evolutionary perspective. So what we do in terms of our rewilding and to regenerate the ecosystems that have been depleted and start to rebuild these mammal populations that have so tragically declined is that we've got to manage all of those threats first. So we've got to manage areas of land where we can suppress invasive species populations. So we're doing large-scale feral cat and fox control. We're restoring proper fire management in the landscape to prevent the occurrence and abundance of wildfires. We're doing landscape-scale weed eradication, and basically we're doing all the science to be able to determine those land management activities going forward. And yeah, as I said, it's managing different threats, and it sounds like from what you three have said, it's actually agriculture and land change and habitat loss is the number one threat here in the UK, whereas in Australia, the number one threat is invasive species, in particular cats and foxes.
Really interesting. So no small task then.
Definitely not.
And why should people here in the UK engage in nature restoration in Australia?
Yep, another great question. So just to throw some stats out there, Australia is about 5% of the world's landmass. We have 10% of the world's biodiversity, and we have 0.3% of the world's human population. So we've got an enormous place, absolutely, just the scale is hard to get your head around, of land that we're now looking after. So it's no small task, really. So biodiversity loss anywhere in the world is a tragedy, and it upsets planetary, ecosystems. It disrupts flows. It can cause, it accelerates climate change, and ultimately disrupts the global economy as well. So having that concentration of biodiversity in a country like Australia that has such a small population of humans, if you even just think about that from a taxpayer viewpoint, if we think surely the Australian government can, get a handle on this, but you've got such a small population looking after this huge landmass, we do need to engage with other parts of the world to start looking at biodiversity loss anywhere in the world as a global problem. Most of the global biodiversity is in the southern hemisphere, if you sort of look below the equator, and most of global wealth is in the northern hemisphere as well. So yeah, everyone's responsibility.
Absolutely, and it makes me think back to what you were talking about the global south and global north and kind of integrating.
I'd love to come in on what Liz was saying, because I completely agree with you. And your point about Australia being the biggest island on the planet, the UK is the 9th biggest island. And the idea of invasive species, it's such an easy conversation. I often use Australia as an example because no hackles are raised when you say, well, the cane toad is non-native to Australia, or the rabbit is non-native. Whereas when people start to say, well, the grey squirrel is non-native in the UK, people go, oh, but they've been here a while now. Surely 160 years is enough time to have their status as kind of non-invasive, or the rabbit, or 4 of our 6 deer species, or rhododendron, or all of the things that the Victorians brought in because they thought they were pretty and fun. And our rainforests, their main threat is invasive species. And a big barrier is we're so nature blind in the UK, especially. We're the most nature denuded country in Europe, and we're so uncomfortable with the idea of saying, well, this species evolved here, has been here since the last glacial maximum 8,500 years ago. Thanks, Mandy. This species it was brought in because humans thought it was pretty. And I think we have such shifting baseline syndrome, such short-term memories, that we're uncomfortable going, well, actually these ones, they all fit within an equilibrious, harmonious ecosystem, and these ones, they are quite damaging to it. And I think something we can learn from Australia certainly is how to be better at identifying what is part of that ecosystem and what isn't.
That's really fascinating. I'm relatively new to the eco space, and trying to learn more about our biodiversity here in the UK. And I know you mentioned Wild Isles earlier as a series. If you haven't seen it, it's hosted by David Attenborough. It's available on the BBC, and it's an incredible documentary series about UK biodiversity and UK species. And it really helped me to understand what is native to our lands, but also things like rhododendron, for example, I always just thought were nice, pretty flowers. So learning that they're actually an invasive species and are threatening to a lot of our habitats is really, really interesting. So I'm going to bring it back to you, Merlin, actually, about the mission of the Thousand Years Trust. And it's to restore Britain's rainforests for our generation, but also for future generations. And I wanted to just talk to you about what it is that our generation what role can they play in protecting rainforests here in the UK?
So I think I mentioned it before about how we're terrible as humans about this short-term thinking. We have very short memories when we look backwards, but also in terms of our courage and ambition about looking forwards. And it's because it's dictated by what politicians say or what businesses say, and they're all stuck in 5-year cycles or 2-year cycles or maybe 10-year cycles if they're being really bold. And it really came to me one time when we were working to triple the size of the rainforest in the valley at Kabila, and I was planting these oak trees and thinking these acorns might still be here as trees in the year 3024, 3020 at the time, I was thinking. And that's so far outside of the horizon of our imagination. And they always say that planting trees you'll never sit in the shade of is a great thing to do. But I think planting trees that your great-great-grandchildren might not sit in the shade of is something that we need to become more comfortable with as a species. We need to be prepared to do things which the effect of them might not be seen for a long time. We all know that we're in a climate change crisis and that there's a lag effect. Even if we all stopped emitting CO2 now, it's still going to be 20 or 30 years before the kind of downward trend that we're seeing in terms of climate patterns starts to flatten off, probably. But we need to have that courage for long-term thinking. And when we come to species reintroductions, things like beavers, but also apex predators, that kind of long-term view is so important because it will take many generations for it to recreate a sense of harmony. So in answer to your question about what our generation and younger generations can do, I think the most important thing is having the courage to to stay the course. We've seen it in Europe with wolf reintroductions where they brought in wolves. It was all looking great. Then some farmers have complained because there's been some livestock taken, and suddenly the governments go, oh, shoot all the wolves and do a big cull. And we have to be comfortable that the oscillating effect of when you reintroduce species will take a while to flatten out. And I think that's the most important thing we can do.
Yeah, I
think like an oak tree, 1,000 years.
Long-term thinking and thinking for not only our generation, but beyond that as well. I think that's something that we're doing through communications is we're really trying to work with the next generation, really trying to turn sort of climate anxiety and doomsday and things that are very sort of real for them into tangible action, mobilizing mindsets, and really getting people to think long-term and think beyond just kind of their current situation and now. And I know, Ben, that you work with the Iris Trust and the Iris Project. We've done a lot of work together. I'd love to know a bit more about that, working with younger generations and why it's so crucial that we do.
Yeah, I think some of the most amazing things that have happened in all fields, but not just the environment, have been done by people young and inexperienced enough not to be afraid of failure. Young, sometimes very young people, 15, 16, 17-year-olds with a great idea and boundless energy, no fear, who've created extraordinary movements. I spent time in Mumbai with a guy called Afroz Shah, and he grew up as a Muslim in the slums of Versova in Mumbai, and he just began cleaning the beach, a beach that was 9 foot deep in plastic. Hadn't been turtles nesting on that beach since the 1930s. And he just started on his own. There's no way he'd still be doing it in 3,000 years if he'd done it on his own. And people just started joining him, famous people, young people, old people. And he's built this kind of Gandhian movement, where thousands of people turn up. And the beach at Versova is now spotless. There are turtles nesting again there. And the movement has spread across Maharashtra, across India. And he's just a perfect example of someone young with an idea who did something amazing. And so I have created the Iris Prize, which is named after my daughter Iris, who we nightmarishly lost at the age of 15 in 2019. Iris was filled with energy and would have done all kinds of amazing things for the environment, I'm sure. She was a huge nature lover, and she wanted to be a barrister and was going to go and work at Client Earth for her first work experience. none of that came to pass. It wasn't meant to be. But the idea of the prize is to lift up other young people who've got similar dreams and ideas and help them with funding, with mentoring, help them build their first website, help them with such things as personal security, help them even just put food on the table at home. They're often the only breadwinner. And we are deluged. So for this year's third round of prizes, which happened in September, we've had 600 applicants. And those are the ones that have passed the screen. So 600 amazing stories from Indonesia to India to Bolivia to Scotland. Amazing, amazing stories. And we pick 3 winners every year, and we have 9 runners-up every year. And it's a growing thing, a kind of Nobel Prize for young environmental activists. And the whole thing is run by very young people. So the idea is 14 to 24 is the age at which you can apply and win a prize, but the whole thing is run by a steering committee of the same age, and yeah, it's flying. It's doing really well. The Iris Prize, have a look.
We love we love working with Iris Project, and we really strongly support working with young people and really giving them a platform and a voice. I think there are so many incredible young people across the globe with so many ideas. And as you say, a lack of fear and real confidence to sort of take a step, which I think when you get older, society starts sort of making you feel like maybe you can't do that. Maybe how would I go about doing that? And I think young people just jump head first and go straight in.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think it's easy, especially for those of us that aren't so young anymore, to feel pessimistic. But what's the point in that? I think there's enormous joy to be had in the world. Just from the immediate connection that we get with nature, with other people, with ourselves. There's enormous joy to be had. Even an Earth which is under huge pressure and is in a state of disequilibrium gives us this unconditional love, or this tremendous joy. And there's even more joy to be had in participating in the restoring of nature, whether it's very local, whether it's a window box on the 34th floor of a tower, putting native seeds and attracting and pollinating insects, or whether it's with the privilege of restoring a larger patch of land like Ewhurst or Kabila, or where I am, Canwood. There's just such tremendous joy to be had and such optimism to be had from participating in that. And I think that younger people tap into that much more readily. They're much less encumbered by fear, and I think that is that's something to be encouraged. I think we need to encourage a culture of optimism and joy in restoration, because we don't know what's going to pan out. We don't know. With the science, of course, the science is scary, but all generations have lived with fear, and I think that that doesn't encourage action at all. So I think optimism should be the default.
Completely agree. It's one of our values at Earth Minutes is around transforming that doomism into optimism and hope.
Can I just add one last thought on that?
Absolutely.
Because whilst I agree with everything Merlin has said about this long-term perspective, the journey towards that long-term outcome is in itself profoundly joyful. So you go to a place like Ewhurst, where Mandy has just started 3 years into rewilding. Even in the first 3 months, you notice a difference. In the first 6 months, you start to see different grasses and flowers and different species coming back in. And the process of nature reawakening is joyful from the first minute. The journey is where it's at, not necessarily the outcome. So I think we should emphasize that there is there's no right moment, no wrong moment to start, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely, it just takes one step. We work with a young urban environmentalist called Cam Roberts, and he talks a lot about that around just taking the first step and planting your first seed, and even if you get it wrong, it doesn't really matter. It's the joy, it's the journey, it's the process. And coming back to you, Mandy, you mentioned Ewhurst. I wanted to talk about how you worked collaboratively and collectively in bringing people into your journey and how you began and the farmers that you work with. I'm just really fascinated.
Well, hope is indeed a very, very powerful thing, and we all need hope. To get people emotionally engaged, to get people excited, because like you say, we forget, and it's hard to envision what this whole project could look like and what it means. And I remember meeting all my neighbors when I just started. I was very interested to get to know what everybody's doing. And the reason for that is so that I can actually zoom out and look at what I can contribute with where I am, and look at it in a landscape perspective. And in every single a project, like even releasing the beavers, which is such an important thing to do, education is actually at the heart of it. Without trying to explain to people or educating everybody around us, this project would probably not have happened. So to bring people along that journey, however difficult that first step is, like you say, like just by doing it, that first step. So I remember prior to the beaver release, I did two, we call them information sessions. One was only for farmers, local landowners, and neighbors, and the other one was open to anybody and everybody in the community, outside of the community, anybody who's heard of it, who's interested to come. And it's a very different two groups of people that turns up. You know, one is more, you know, they are generational businesses that have done in a certain way, and I feel them, I understand them. It's hard to all of a sudden say, let's not plow this field anymore, let's do something completely different. It sounds insane, but you know, by you know, being the first person to say, hey, let's sit and talk and see what this looks like. Maybe you don't like the sound of it, but let's have a conversation. And I remember one of the first comments was, you cannot introduce beaver. We have a fishing business here. The beaver will eat our fish. And I said, if the beaver starts eating fish, we have a whole different problem on its own, because beavers are, they don't eat fish. They are herbivores. They eat vegetations.
Yep.
And so I think that you know, that engaging and getting people engaged, it's really important in that education piece. Like, why are we doing this? What can we expect from this? You know, what are the benefits of this? I didn't even know much about beaver myself before embarking on this journey. And now I could spin out some fun facts.
Give us a fun fact. Sorry, put you on the spot.
No, I like that. So beaver has, their fur is so dense. There are about 10,000 strands of hair per square centimeter.
Wow.
That's why they were hunted to extinction, because it's so amazing.
So Merlin on my left here is so in love with the, quite rightly, with the importance of beavers. You know, the keystone of all keystone species, that he had a beaver tattooed onto his right buttock. And he does have a tattoo on his right buttock of a beaver. It would be marvelous if he show it, but I don't think he will.
The audience are requesting.
I think it's not just any beaver, it's my beaver. It's my first beaver. So we introduced our first beaver in 2020, which is called Sigourney Beaver. And she's an incredible matriarch.
Is she married to?
Married to Jean-Claude Van Damme, her husband. Yeah, and he's fantastic as well. And they had two little children called Beavy Nix and Beavy Wonder. And so I did actually send the artist a load of photographs of Sigourney, and it is actually Sigourney Beaver who is on my...
And there are beavers now back in London. I mean, some of you may have seen the videos of Sadiq Khan himself releasing beavers into the river at Ealing, and they're at Enfield, and rumours of some free-living beavers a little bit further up the Thames. So beavers back in the centre of London would have been inconceivable 10 years ago. Now, I think this is something, if you'd stopped a random person in the street in any English village, town or city 10 years ago and asked them about British beavers, they'd have said, what? You know, it's a North American species, you know, Canadian species, oh, and they eat fish. No one would have had any idea about British beavers. Today, most people, whether they're involved in nature or not, old, young, rich, poor, you know, rural, urban, they know that beavers are native, that they're back, and that they play a keystone role in mitigating flooding and drought whilst breathing life back into our landscapes. This is an enormous shift that's taking place in this country, an awakening around nature and the importance of nature, not just as provider of everything that we have and everything that we love, but on a more visceral level. I think people have really tuned into the importance of nature to their physical well-being, to their spiritual well-being. They understand now it's something that we need. And we're seeing that reflected in politics. Now, there's lots to complain about, but the reality is on both sides of the political spectrum, there are lots and lots of promises and lots of interesting things happening. You know, all farm subsidies in this country are now entirely contingent upon the delivery of public environmental goods. Now, that's radical, and it was done by a Conservative government, and the Labour government-to-be have promised to adhere to it and grow it. So there's lots happening. I think we can get lost in the weeds and not notice how big a shift is taking place. And the symbol of that shift, I think, is the beaver tattoo on this military veteran's right butt cheek.
That is so brilliant. And it leads me so well. I was going to ask you how people can collectively get involved in restoring nature other than getting a tattoo on a buttocks. What can people do, and what actions can they take on their doorsteps right now to get involved? We'll start with Ben, happy to, and then go round.
I mean, by the way, I was going to say, Lizzie has the most unbelievable set of videos on the Australian Wildlife Conservancy's website of volunteers and school kids and indigenous communities releasing wildlife back into landscapes. So it's not just it's happening everywhere. I do a podcast called Rewilding the World every 2 weeks, and I interviewed 2 weeks ago a guy called Elliot Newton from an organization called Citizen Zoo. And they're in London only at the moment, and they build these huge groups of local volunteers in different parts of London to do habitat restoration. So from Tooting to Wandsworth to Ealing to Enfield, pulling out rubbish and shopping trolleys from watercourses and planting native species and putting brash and wood piles and reintroducing thousands of water voles and beavers and glowworms and amazing stuff. And people really want to be part of this. And so this volunteer-led rewilding is now a growing thing. It's happening everywhere. So Citizen Zoo is the main one in London. And I think it's really, really important that people are physically part of it because it solves so many other problems through society. You know, we know now empirically that hospital patients, if they can just see nature out of their hospital window, get better faster. And anyone who's been in charge of children knows that there's no problem that isn't fixed by throwing the doors open and going outside into nature. You know, they just need it. And so I think this volunteering thing is perhaps the most important part of it.
I think so much of it has been said, and I agree with everything that Ben and others have said. I think volunteering as well as citizen science, you know, we don't have to be a scientist to get involved in some of the really important scientific research that needs to be done, especially around things like mental health and well-being. You know, a lot of this research has been done in places like Japan, where they have a really well-established forest bathing and Shinrin-yoku culture, and trying to create that. These societal shifts, they only happen. The whole point of a democracy is that things happen when everybody plays their little small part. And so whether it is doing the little bit you have with your window box, your garden, making space for nature, putting in wet spaces, allowing insects and pollinators to thrive, volunteering in places, which we're all trying to create opportunities for volunteers, or supporting charities that are working in that space as well. I think there's so much people can do.
Yeah, 2 points there. So I used to work at WWF, and they do a lot of citizen science, and they used to have a really fun game where you could find walruses, and it was just up to citizens to go, and it was, you just clicked on the walrus, and it was a fun game for kids, for adults, for everyone, but it was all around identifying walruses in specific spaces and really getting people involved in a way that's fun and gamifying it. The other point was about Japanese forest bathing, because I was actually reading about that last night in a book called The Nature Fix, which my founder, Emma, recommended to me by Florence Williams. And I was wondering whether you knew anything about whether they're bringing those sorts of practices to the UK, because essentially what it is it's spending time in forests has been shown to reduce blood pressure and to better your mental well-being and your physical well-being. And they're doing a lot of science around it in Japan. I just wanted to quickly touch on that.
Yeah, so my start point with this is I was in the military for about a decade and did 3 tours in Afghanistan and started to suffer very badly with complex PTSD a few years back. And at the same time, actually, my wife and I were trying to start a family, and she was suffering a number of miscarriages, some at quite an advanced stage, and was really struggling with her mental health as well. We all know that we're living in the middle of a mental health pandemic. Post-COVID, it's been really difficult for many of the marginalized areas of society, especially. And for me, I was so lucky to have this rainforest in Cornwall, which is my old family farm and my home, that I was able to immerse myself in and heal in. And so everything towards building the research station and understanding this, we know that temperate rainforests are a pinnacle habitat in the UK for carbon sequestration, for biodiversity abundance, but I think most importantly, they're a pinnacle habitat for mental health and well-being. Your cortisol level drops from spending 30 minutes in a temperate rainforest, and that can still be measured up to 2 weeks later. It increases kidney function, immune system response. It puts us from our sympathetic nervous state, our fight or flight, into our parasympathetic, our rest and digest. So everything about these habitats is integral to our well-being and our equilibrium and our homeostasis. And we still live in this kind of Judeo-Christian narrative that we are other from nature, that we are not apart, we're apart from nature. And I think a big part of rewilding and all the work that Ben and everyone else is doing here is about helping humans to understand that we're an ecosystem engineer, we're a keystone species, and that we're integral to these habitats. And once we stop seeing ourselves as other, we can start to truly love them and truly heal them.
That's great.
Well, on that note, community as well. I went to church last Sunday and I got extremely excited walking into church when the tiny little strip of land in between the traffic going in and out, there was a sign that says, wildflowers have been planted around here to encourage our pollinators.
Cool.
And I was really happy, and the children all stopped and looked at that sign. So community engagement on top of everything that everybody's just said, I think is really important. So get your friends excited, tell your friends about any tiny little detail, like if there's a volunteering program or something you watched on TV, a great book you read, like what you just shared. I think just get people around you excited. I mean, there is power in number. Everybody just needs to get on it.
I love that, bringing it into a space where it might not be expected, but everyone's engaged and everyone's so interested. As you say, the kids go and look at the flowers, and really cool. Lizzie, have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things to think about is what really drives us to care about a species extinction or a species loss. I'm sure everyone in the audience would be mortified to think koalas are now on the endangered list because they're koalas, how on earth could this happen? Meanwhile, the Bramble Cay mellimus is a native rodent that went extinct in Australia in 2019. And even though that species isn't as charismatic and the poster child of Australia as koalas are, every single loss of biodiversity on the planet matters. And every single species causes some sort of hole in the tapestry of the bigger ecosystem. I grew up in Tasmania, as I mentioned before, and this is supposed to be an area that's renowned for being, teeming with wildlife and this wilderness, endless wilderness. And we had a German exchange student stay with us. That was my sister who brought him over, and then Mum's in the audience here. Mum and I had to entertain him. And one of the things he said to me, and I was in the final year of high school, and he said, where are all the animals? Where's all the wildlife? And he had this list, things that he wanted to tick off and things that he wanted to see. And I was looking through it, and it was, an eastern barred bandicoot, and, an eastern bettong and things like that. And I just, I was sort of a little bit shocked, and I thought I knew quite a lot about the native, the natural ecosystem, and I ended up studying ecology. And it was only when I did my degree, my environmental science degree, that I realised that we actually are living in a total marsupial ghost town. And when you look back at these historic records of early settlers that could just ride their horses or whatever through Central Australia, and there were so many bettongs around, they could actually lift them up from the ground from their horse. They could go down and grab them for their dinner. There were that many around. And now we've got, again, the shifting baseline where we just accept that, these beautiful mammals that we have in our emblems and everything like that, we just grow up never ever being able to see one in the wild, and that's really, really sad. So I think my sort of advice, I'd say, is be curious and think about each individual species and their role in the ecosystem. What are we missing? What are these keystone species that are missing from the ecosystem, and what is a true healthy ecosystem meant to look like?
That's really important. And I think something that really ties into that is the variety of lived experiences and really hearing other people's voices in this, because I've learned so much just in the past couple of years of being in this space from stories like that, for example, and humanizing the stories and really sort of, it brings you back, and it brings you back to the root of why you should care. And I know every single one of you here has spoken about that today, about what brings it back and why should people care and how can people connect. And I just wanted to touch on why it's so important to bring all these different people together and different lived experiences globally and locally. I don't know if anyone has any other additional thoughts on that. No.
Well, I guess the lived experiences is one I think about quite a lot, because in Australia we're, as I mentioned, incredibly remote, and a lot of the areas that we work across are you can't even access by car. So we're in a really unique situation where we need to facilitate a connection to nature in an equitable way, because it also costs a lot to get to these sites. So how do you connect people with nature when it's inaccessible?
Yep.
And then, it's a bit of a catch-22, because being inaccessible means that we have a relatively low rate of disturbance to those ecosystems. So in the northwest of Australia, in the Kimberley, it's the only place in Australia that is with no known mammal extinctions, and that's purely because it's just so hard to get to. So I think the connection with nature can come in many forms, and it doesn't necessarily have to be paying thousands of pounds to get out to the wilderness, which, a lot of people do see it as. It's more about, I think, again, to say it again, it's being curious about what's even on your doorstep. And I think everyone mentioned, if you can do anything just within your space, then that's still something, that's still that step forward.
Brilliant. And that's a really good note to end on. It's just getting out in your natural space, identifying what that is around you, identifying the species that are local to you as well. I mean, in London, we've got 14,000 different species of plants and animals and fungi. That's a fun fact I like to throw out there because I learned it a few weeks ago. But just understanding what's there is really going to help to connect you back to the planet. Amazing. And I think that's all the questions we have. I wanted to just open up to anyone in the audience to see if anyone has any questions. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you guys for sharing all your thoughts. I guess one thing with the fitting title of Time to Walk on the Wild Side is that currently we are being limited to being able to access our wildlife. I haven't talked in a while in front of loads of people, sorry. So in terms of engagement and allowing engagement from a grassroots level, we are under pressing controversial kind of land acts, and landowners and forest managers and land managers, I'd like to hear your thoughts on kind of, obviously it's controversial because yes, we can't trust all grassroots people in kind of, sorry, I'm losing my words. Basically, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how you guys want to increase engagement to grassroots level without disturbing the natural environment. And obviously, this is really hard to do. Grassroots level for inner city kids is highly unachievable to afford to go on these retreats or forest activations, etc. How do you guys foresee the future for grassroots levels to increase engagement with the changing land laws and acts? Sorry, that took a while.
I mean, I think we need to bring nature to people for a start. You know, there's no reason why nature needs to be over there and not over here. I set up the Rewilding London Task Force, and we're investing in rewilding from the bottom up throughout the City of London. So veins or corridors of nature down the canals and railways and road verges, connecting up the pockets of nature that there are in green spaces in the parks. Anyone who's been in Regent's Park or Hyde Park in the last year will see this little exclosures in which scrub is growing up, piles of dead wood, you know, new rough, reedy edges to the watercourses. You know, we've been funding the handing out of wildflower seeds to people who have window boxes or small garden spaces. There's loads you can do to bring species and nature back to where people live. There's no reason why a kid going to school in Tower Hamlets shouldn't be able to look up and see a peregrine falcon or a white-tailed sea eagle or storks kind of kettling on their way to migrate south in the autumn. You know, these are all species that would do very well in the City of London, in some cases already are. And then I think there's the question of access to the wider countryside. You know, only 8% of England is accessible to people. Now, I find those images on a summer's day on the Express newspaper of people crammed like sardines on the beaches a little bit depressing, because that's all they can think to do. You know, in France or Spain, you know, people fan out from the cities and they go all directions into their countryside. And that we don't have that same connection in England as those European countries, and I think we need to figure out a solution for that. I sympathize with the idea that if you've got a farm on the edge of a city and suddenly you have a free-for-all right to roam, you're going to have 5,000 picnickers there every Saturday. That makes life impossible for those landowners who are near cities. So I think it needs to be done in such a way that's probably opt-in rather than opt-out. So where you offer an incentive under the Environmental Land Management Scheme, for example, for people to create habitat for humans, you know, in some way. So I don't think it can be blanket right to roam in England as they've got in Scotland, but who knows?
Yeah, I'll add to that. In my journey in learning more about what, you know, we're doing wetland creation, what does it look like, you know, what's the process? So I went to look at different wetland sites, from inception to 5-year long to 10-year long, and then that's when I found out that there's all these natural trust site or wildlife trust site that you can actually access. And they have invested so much in putting up signage and boards that you can read about it and follow their journey. As a landowner, I mean, the government, under the ELM scheme, there's some really good schemes as well. Even under countryside stewardships, we get an incentive of about £300 to organize educational visits. So then, you know, nobody makes money out of these things, because the logistics of it is obviously more than £300 already, but it's to do it. So we get children over. You'd be surprised. It's not just children in the city that doesn't get access. It's actually rural children, rural schools who's come to Earhurst, and our feedback from the teachers is, wow, we never get to go on trips like this to have outdoor learning. So there are incentives of it. We just need to get more people to do it, and you know, whether it's just going out, like Ben said, to, you know, sites that in the city that you can experience that, or going out to the countryside. There are options available.
Yeah, sure.
So I just wanted to mention one example, because you make a really good point. And Wisman's Wood, which many, I'm sure, of you will be familiar with, was a wonderful example of ancient temperate rainforest on Dartmoor. It's a very small site. It's only about 8 acres, but it's owned by the Dutch, and it's within the national park, so it's all open access. And during COVID, when everyone was being encouraged to kind of explore what nature they had around them, it was very heavily walked through. Lots of people took their dogs through, lots of dog crap and tinfoil barbecues and all sorts of other detritus went in there. And these are habitats that take sometimes thousands of years to get to the state that they're in. The lichens, the mosses, the polypody ferns, these species take centuries, if not millennia, to fully establish. And so for me, the fundamental issue here is around education. People often talk about Norway, Sweden, Scotland, where they have much better land access and right to roam movements, which we should absolutely have in England and across the UK, but we're not investing in educating young people or older people in how to treat the natural world. And if we're not if we don't know how to walk through a forest without damaging it, how to behave in a way that actually allows the species that are being reintroduced to have a stress-free environment where they don't have lots of people crowding them, then I think that until we have that, we just need to be cautious in how we approach this, because we have to put the restoration of nature at the very forefront of everything we're doing. We also have to open that nature up to more and more people, but people have to have an obligation upon them to learn how to interact with that nature so that it continues to restore.
Yeah, just thinking about, I was just thinking of an example as you guys were talking, because we had on one of our sanctuary sites, we have an education program set up at Yukumara Sanctuary in South Australia, and that's where we have children sort of from the age of 12 up to sort of 17, school age, come and experience life on sanctuary and start to see some of these natural processes that are that we've restored in the environment inside of our sanctuary sites. And some of the stories that come out of them are the most incredible and most rewarding stories that then get told around internally in our organisation. So I think as well as that having the initiative to do it within organisations and on land, there also has to be the funding for it. We couldn't do that, as a non-profit without funding. So I think having an education first funding priority in certain areas is critical. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to facilitate those things and have that connection.
No, it's okay. I was just going to add to that and say that we do a lot of work at Earth Minutes around educating young people on how they can reconnect to the planet. And so, for example, we have films and social media, but we also do digital experiences. And I think part of it is really getting young people to understand why it's so important to protect nature, what it is like to connect with nature, what that really means, and to really understand their habitats. And as you say, I think the point is really interesting of we could let everyone roam free and walk around habitats very openly, but a lot of people don't have that awareness and understanding and education on how you really look after where you are, because there is that disconnect. And as you say, Ben, they see it as sort of an other. It's like an extra space outside of your internal space, which is a building, essentially, and ceilings and walls. So it's a really good point around educating people and encouraging people to get outside, but also encouraging people to learn about where they're walking, the grass they're walking on, the trees that they're surrounding them, and I think the two tie in really well. I'm not sure if we have any more time for questions. I don't know where Annika is. She said she would wave at me at time. One more question? Okay, awesome. Does anyone else have any questions in the audience? Yes, perfect.
Yeah, I'm just interested in the effect of humans in this world in space, because you want to bring back the hierarchy of animals as well, not because it begins with the bugs and the insects up to the wild cat, to the beaver. So would there be spaces where you'd have to stop humans so that the actual wild in the hierarchical animal disciplines could come back again?
I don't think so. I think wildlife is far more resilient than we think. There are wolves are incredibly scarce 30, 40 years ago in Europe. And they're now in the city precincts of Paris, Amsterdam, Madrid, Luxembourg. You can watch beavers building their dams in the parks in the middle of Hamburg and Munich, Zaragoza in Spain. I think wildlife doesn't mind us as much as we think it does. The reason why we think of these, especially the larger species, as being animals that live in remote wild landscapes is because that's the only place they could cling on to hide from the hunters that were everywhere. And now that a lot of these animals are protected and the idea of killing them doesn't appeal to the majority of people, I think we're discovering that they're quite happy to live among us. With exceptions, there are certain, for example, the beach breeding birds, all those little oyster catchers and golden plovers and things that breed on the beaches have real trouble with people letting their dogs off the lead. And, there's, of course, there's exceptions. But I think fundamentally people can live in and move through wild landscapes without doing much harm. But as Merlin said, you just need them to know not to start fires or chuck litter or shoot stuff.
And I think there's a wonderful example of kind of reverse nominative determinism, exactly as Ben's saying, that we called it a pine marten or a Scottish wildcat or a Dalmatian pelican or an Irish elk, just because that was the last place they were when we got round to naming them, because we'd killed them everywhere else. And actually, we would have had Dalmatian pelicans all across the UK. We just gave them that name because that was the last place they were remaining when we came to name them. And I think that with everything Ben's saying, it's again incumbent upon us to behave in the way that humans have evolved to behave. We are an ecosystem engineer, we're an apex predator, we're a keystone species, and if we want to be a part of these trophic systems, then we shouldn't shy away from that. And I have this debate with people a lot around things like deer management, which people, we've all grown up with Disney and Roald Dahl and Bambi, and as a result, we kind of retrench away from that. But if we want to create healthy, functioning ecosystems and view ourselves as a part of that natural environment, then we have to remember what our niche within it was and what it still should be, because the animals still will view us in the way that we've evolved to be, to interact with them.
Does anyone else have any other thoughts?
I might just add also, I realised something very important I didn't add before, is that Australia, for around 65,000 years, has been a managed landscape. So this isn't a new concept that we're coming in and saying that we've got to do all this stuff. First Nations Australians have been there for millennia and introduced the concept of fire, using fire to hunt, to change the ecosystem types, also part of cultural burning. And over time, that created different, plant species that relied on this fire to then reproduce. So I think the concept that wilderness is only true wilderness without people it's incorrect. It's an incorrect notion, and something that we really try to do is make sure that every single land management activity that we undertake, we're doing with those First Nations partners, with our First Nations stakeholders. And unfortunately, the really sad reality is that a lot of that knowledge has been lost over the last couple of centuries, just due to dispossession of the land. I could give you a whole history lesson, but I won't right now. But it's a very fascinating, but unfortunately very sad history that we've got to work hard to really get back and make sure that First Nations Australians and First Nations people everywhere have that connection to country. It's a part of, I suppose, their being that we've got to facilitate. Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for listening to this discussion. Thank you to all our amazing panelists. And thank you to Hangout for having us. And have a good rest of your day.